We've got Chris Myers from B-Side Capital here joining on the Omni podcast today. Chris, appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today. To kick things off, can you just tell us a little bit about B-Side?
Yeah, absolutely. So B-Side is really two companies, but our primary group, B-Side Capital, is one of the larger certified development companies, CDCs, in the US. And if you're not familiar with what a CDC is, it's essentially a SBA lender that specializes in the 504 SBA loan program for small business owners that are looking to acquire owner occupied real estate and other means of responsible SBA backed capital for America's small business owners. So that's the primary organization. B-Side has been around in one form or another for over 35 years now, which is really, really great. And then we have a sister company called B-Side Fund, which is really where all of our direct lending investment opportunity programs, reside. So really, if you're looking for SBA loans, it's B-Side Capital. If it's anything other than SBA, it's B-Side Fund.
And so, company B-Side been around in some shape or form for since 1990. What about you? When did you join the company?
So I joined as the CEO in late 2020, which was obviously a very interesting time
Great timing,
to
yeah.
to be joining a company. But my background, like you, is actually in tech. So I had a fintech startup that was no longer a startup after a while, ran it for about 10 years, and sold it in 2018 to a publicly traded bank tech company. And then, found myself looking for something to do after a decent exit, invested in a few companies, ran an organization down in Australia for a while, but then when COVID hit, decided to come back and was actually approached by a recruiter for looking to find the next CEO for what has become B-Side. And I had actually had the pleasure of working with, or at least being somewhat familiar with the team back in my startup days, my tech days, and was always just wildly impressed with the organization and the reach and the reputation, and so decided to join, and the rest is history.
So tell me a little bit about the kind of customer profile that you're typically working with. So you've got the two businesses here. You've got the B-side capital and the B-side funds. And so this is SBA lending, and then you've got the whole other kind of like sectors of non-SBA, other types of direct lending there. So what's kind of like the ideal like SMB customer that you're looking for? Is this oftentimes like acquisition, like people want to buy into a small business, or is it just across the board?
It's across the board. So the 504 loan program, which is our bread and butter, and has been our focus for the bulk of our history, is really designed for small business owners that are looking to acquire commercial real estate. So owner occupied commercial real estate. Think of a manufacturer, particularly in this environment, looking to buy a new, facility or a warehouse or an office building or something along those lines, right? That is really our primary 504 focus. And so those business owners are generally not startups. They're generally mid-sized businesses, small, we say small, but that is a little bit of a misnomer or maybe an inaccurate term because that can go from, a two-person side hustle as a small business all the way up to, a 50 plus person company
Yeah.
that's been around for a long time. So really we're looking for established businesses that are looking to essentially find a way to create wealth, right, over time. The program, the 504 program, was created in with small business owners who may not have a lot of tangible enterprise value in mind. So think about, for example, my father-in-law owns a classic car shop in Arizona, world-renowned classic car shop, one of a kind type of thing. People will ship vehicles from around the world in for them to work on and the like. But so a very successful business. But the value is tied up in him as the owner, and his brother, who's the master mechanic and co-owner of the business, right? So great business, makes a lot of money, very successful, but without those two, there's not a lot of enterprise value, right? They are the business.
Right.
And so in those instances, if you go to sell a company like that, what's the exit plan? What's the value? And so the idea with that is that, well, if you offer a responsible, affordable path for those business owners to acquire real estate, physical assets, that can also play a role in the exit, right?
Right.
Facilities actually being for
There's
sale.
a little bit more to it beyond just the two
Correct.
owners.
Correct, right? So those are the types of businesses that we look for. We generally think of our, or at least have historically thought of our customers though as the banks, regional banks. Customer acquisition is a tough thing in any business,
Yeah.
right? It's the secret to success, no matter what industry you're in. And I think for us, we have to be or realistic about the fact that the bulk of customer acquisition actually happens on the bank side. Those banks that have the deposit relationship, the regional local bankers that are cultivating that and building those relationships, they're the ones that are out there producing loans, right? That are producing these deals. And so what we have historically done is actually cultivate the relationships with those banks and those individual bankers so that when they have a 504 loan, they actually come to us. And the reason why this works is a little bit of a quirk of the program. So when you do a 504 SBA loan, there are three parties involved. There's the borrower, and they put in 10%, equity
Yeah.
capital. There is the bank, a traditional bank that does 45%. And then there is the CDC, like us, that does the remaining 45%. So you have to have all three pieces for this to work and to get the SBA guarantee. So generally, the banks do most of the sourcing and the relationship management, and then we come in towards the end. This is changing. Well, evolving, right? Because competition has increased in our industry significantly over the last few years. We are always looking for more ways to bring value to everyone involved in the equation. And so for the bankers, that has become actually helping to source deals and provide them with deals. So kind of flipping the relationship a little bit so that that is more value additive for our partners.
Yeah, I think the what I've heard kind of across, well, really any industry is that, yeah, it all comes down to customer acquisition. At the end of the day, it'd be so much easier to build any business if you didn't have to worry about getting customers. So,
Yeah, business
how
would
are you getting?
bu-
Yeah,
yeah, business would be great and easy if it weren't for customers and employees, right?
it really would be. How are you getting people in the door right now? That's actually two questions on this one. How are you getting people in the door right now? And then has that changed recently? Kind of since the time you've been at the company?
Well, it has changed in the sense that we never really did it before, right? Again, historically, it was just always, to be frank, a little bit of a mini monopoly that we had, right? And this was not unique just to us. It was unique to the industry in the sense that in each state you have, a handful, maybe no more than two or three generally, organizations like ours. And there's always one that is the dominant player, right? And so deals just sort of came in historically. You didn't have to really worry about that. It wasn't a super competitive environment. And that's changed clearly. And so for us, what we've done is we've actually adopted much more of a sales culture, right? So a culture of actually being out in the field, of pushing, building the relationships. We've designed an entire class of team member called the CRO, a client relationship officer, that's out there as a business development tool, essentially, right? Out there cultivating relationships and designing that. For the direct side, where we're actually bringing people in, we've focused a lot on content, on written content. And that's really been my background as well. So throughout the last 15 years, I've done a lot in media. So I wrote for Forbes for 10 years. I had a TV show with MSNBC that I did for about the same amount of time, a lot of stuff along those lines. And so going back to that well of talking about not only the topics that are pertinent to small business, pertinent to our industry, but just going on in general. And leadership has been a big focus of that. So we have a publication, a blog that we do called the B-Side Way that really touches on our unique culture and what it means to be successful in our organization, but that extends beyond to the businesses we serve and also the macroeconomic environment and what we're seeing from that side. So that has been a big channel for us to get people in through various social networks and just word of mouth. And then, a lot of it is building the right lead capture infrastructure, right? The ability to take a funnel and actually put people in through the system, qualify them, help them understand, educate them, and the like. And so, one of the big things we're doing there is launching our own new internal, well, not internal, our new AI program for small business, AI financial management platform called B-Side Assist. And what this is really a modern iteration of the company that I founded, years ago, that was all about financial insights for small business and access to capital. Now, using various LLM models and our own tools, we've been able to take that to the next level. So people are able to connect their bank accounts, connect their, all of their financial accounts. It'll do their cash basis accounting instantaneously, give them the dashboard that they are looking for, but really have natural language interface to ask, what's going on in my business? What should I be concerned about? What are the things that you're seeing? How do I handle this particular leadership situation or staffing situation? And all of that is, interactive to the extent that it also gives us visibility into some of the needs of these businesses so that we can be proactive in reaching out and saying, did you know you could qualify for responsible capital through us or through our programs? That is, think about it, 500 basis points generally, cheaper than what you could get elsewhere because it's guaranteed and backed and mission based. So that's another big part of it, and that's another way that we're really pushing that customer acquisition model going forward.
I've seen this as well for in a lot of institutions are really pushing this, customer acquisition, but also like the customer lifetime value. Because oftentimes you're operating in what's becoming an increasingly competitive market, and capital is one of those things that is very competitive just on the basis points. And so when people are
Finally.
shopping around, like there's a numerical comparison going on to, what can I get, how fast can I get it, and what's it going to cost me? And so a lot of times, the best customer is the one you already have. So someone who is already in the door, and you can kind of continue to build and nurture that relationship with them versus going out and finding new people.
Yeah, and it's a different way to think about it in our industry, frankly. I mean, coming from a tech background like you and like what we talked about, the cycle is very fast. The relationships are scaling or scaled, right? So you're dealing with a lot of volume, a lot of kissing a lot of frogs, working through a lot of things to get to those converted buyers. That is very much a SaaS, consumer product mindset. In our space, relationships are very slow. They go years, decades in some cases, because our products are slow, right? I mean, you think about fintech, you think about lending, and you go to any kind of online lender, and it's a very fast process. You put in a little bit of information, you get your funds the next day. Those are smaller dollar amount loans, obviously, and they're very expensive. Right? So the trade-off is with a SBA loan, you're talking several $1 million in many cases, but it's tied to construction. It's a 18-month period in some cases. So I think when you have a mismatch between the speed of delivery of your product and the speed of customer acquisition, that tends to sort of push you in a particular direction. Right? So our industry is not tech savvy at all. It's as slow and boring of an industry as there is out there. And I'm not shy to say that. It just is, right? It's banking, but more boring. Think about it that way, okay? So as a result, you tend to have very slow moving, very traditional, old-fashioned, outdated models at play in our space, which is why more modern bankers, the newer generation of bankers that are coming out that look at having to work with the CDC, they sort of groan at times because the speed of which most organizations like mine move is very slow. B-side is a major exception to that, right? We have a very, and this is more of a recent mentality, a very fast paced, nimble, tech based mentality, right? And that's where we've adopted these things and we've adopted the ability to think more in terms of the tools and modalities of SaaS based customer acquisition while still maintaining a very traditional approach when it comes to relationship building, understanding the needs of the customer, understanding the needs of our partners, not being afraid to do the hard work, the long work, to build that trust and that admiration and that brand recognition that is so critical. So it's not an either or, it's a yes and, right? To borrow an old improv, trope. It's yes, we build the relationships, we leverage our 35-year history, the trust that people have placed in us over those years, the major impact we've had in the particularly the Colorado economy. I mean, OtterBox, for example, the phone case company was one of our early products or early customers that we helped really get established, that sort of thing, with a much more modern, fast-paced approach. So we need to do both. You need to have respect to both and a foot in both worlds, honestly, to be able to thrive in this environment.
So I originally actually come from banking. So back in the day, pre tech, I was doing middle market commercial finance, particularly for like private equity acquisitions,
Yep.
and so was plugged into a lot of this, and it'd be very similar, kind of customer bases there they're going through, and they're doing some type of leveraged buyout, and so plugged into the industry there and was very familiar with the just how slow things are and how manual so much of it is. And one of the main reasons that made me want to get into tech was just doing the same repetitive work every day, thinking like, wow,
Hmm.
hold on, there's got to be some way that we can, we can automate some of this. And to be honest, took me a long time actually to get to a point recently where I'm thinking back to my former career and realizing that okay, like a lot of stuff actually was really difficult to add automation to back in the day. LLMs are this little bit of a silver bullet here for being able to do stuff that would have been particularly difficult to build kind of back in the day. So interested to
It's
hear about that.
Yeah. Well, it's so funny you say that because that's my origin story too. I was doing mid-market investment banking, valuation work, you know, living in an Excel model, and this was back in 2007, 8, 9. And it was hilarious because what you said, working in that industry and going, so much of this could be automated. That was the genesis of the company I founded, which was called Bodhi True. Right? That was the exact genesis of it. And this was obviously pre-LLM, so we had to sort of anticipate what people would do and walk them through what was effectively a very guided process. And I think that's
Yeah.
all pre-AI SaaS, right? And so it was very difficult to do and very difficult to automate. And, one of the things I learned from that process that I think is changing now is this idea of, particularly coming up in the 2000, late aughts, early 2010s, was this idea of, oh, disruption, right? Disruption. We're going to disrupt this industry. We're going to disrupt banking, is inefficient. Let's disrupt it. Well, why hasn't anyone been successful at doing that? Right? Why has no one really disrupted banking? Why is there no, online bank that has really just taken off? All of the online banks that have survived have either been acquired by traditional banks and turned into them, or they've just gone, to the wayside. Well, it's because some industries, some things are very difficult to do or difficult to automate. Banking being one of them, due to the regulatory environment, due to any number of relationship, sort of unique human-based interactions. You can't just turn it into an algorithm. It's not a step-by-step process. It is a gut feel in some cases. It's intuition. It's history, right? And so that was, I think, why those things have never been changed. Now, to your point, I do believe we are inching towards, or maybe sprinting towards in some cases, a new future where LLMs are the silver bullet, where LLMs allow for that intuition, that training, that gut feel to be done automatically or at scale, or maybe not automatic, but with as a major assist to the humans utilizing it. I mean, I think the biggest risk towards AI really disrupting the banking space, the lending space, is regulation. That's going to be the challenge, right? Because many times when you have a pure, facts, data-driven approach, that may lead to outcomes that are not really acceptable, right? Meaning that perhaps, your bank is missing out on a strategic opportunity, seeing a spark in someone, right? It's like an early stage investing. The idea and the pitch deck and all of that is great, but really great early stage investors see a spark in a founder. They see something in that individual that may not be purely logical, purely data, supported, but they take a bet on that person. LLMs are helping to move in that direction. And it's a space that I think is absolutely fascinating. And that's how we're utilizing it, obviously for our small business customers, which is the easier side of them. Like, tell me, what am I spending my money on, and how can I cut expenses more effectively, or what should I do in this situation? Right? Those are a little bit more tactical. But our internal use of AI, our internal, hive mind that we've built and are continue to build, is where I think it's moving towards being a sounding board for our team, being a tool that, sure, it can handle some tactical tasks, right? Summarize this information, search this insurance for the right clause, whatever that may be, obvious. But also help us spot opportunities, help us understand why this might be, something we want to take a risk on, right? And that piece of it, I think, is really, really the fascinating part. And as you know, too, the power of an LLM and the power of AI as a broad statement really comes down not to the connections it can make, but to how it's trained, which is why, your chat GPT account can come up with a different tone and different insights and different conclusions than mine does, because mine is trained on how I think, yours is trained on how you think. And I think you're going to see that emerge in organizations. So it's not the ones that are just quick to adopt a technology. That's a binary decision at this point. You're either going to be left behind or you're not. It- But really determining who's going to be successful, I think, comes down to how well can an organization train, right? How can you go through the very difficult process of extracting institutional knowledge, refining it, understanding this is what I believe, this is what we believe, helping the system understand that, and then providing it with the right type of ongoing guidance and training so that it can really truly be, an external brain. That's what we need. And that's the direction I think it's going. And so,
I think
whether it's
I think
in
that is one of
lending or,
the
yeah.
one of the most well. There's actually there are two things in what you just said. One is yes, trying to accumulate all of what is effectively tribal knowledge
Mhm.
into something that the LLM can actually understand, because it's really great at making these atomic decisions when it's presented with all of the information. And companies are always surprised by like how much information only lives in like back and forth messages and like in a couple people's heads. Like it's never
Right.
even been written down somewhere. And so this is where we see kind of like one of the biggest failure modes in trying to integrate LLMs into some type of process is you just didn't give it the information that it needed to make this decision. And that's because some of this information was never even written down to begin with. But a another big problem area that we've seen a lot is people adopting new technology at the fringes. And this is happening with LLMs. It's also happened with every other bit of technology that's ever come out, which is there's always this overarching fear of process change
Right.
where people don't want to change a process. And so what you'll have like inefficient process A, inefficient process B, and people will say like, hey, we can actually like squeeze in like an LLM powered tool right here in the middle. And then what you're doing there is you're probably putting in a lot of time and effort to actually like roll out this tool and like build this out internally. But you're
Exactly.
getting maybe this like 5% process efficiency gain here because you're really just trying to like shoehorn it into everything that's been done already. And this is what we see all the time because it's, the big like, process word that everyone's afraid of. It's like no one wants to change the way things are working today. And
Right.
so as a result, you end up probably spending a lot more time and effort to get something that works worse because you're like making it, attack onto your existing.
Yeah. Well, I think that's you hit the nail on the head. That's the mindset problem that I see on a widespread level in business, right? But particularly in my industry, is that when you think about AI as the shiny new thing, it's like people, particularly, folks that have been through other major technological advances, think of it in the same way, right? They think of it as, oh, I have a BlackBerry. I can answer emails on the road. Or, oh, look at Excel. We used to do it by hand and now we can use Excel, or we can use this or messaging or, whatever as a incremental, discrete, tactical tool. And honestly, if you're thinking about it that way, if you know, you're going to be disappointed. No, well, you're going to be disappointed because you're going to do it wrong. That's the first part. The second part is I think people look to AI and, as you're describing, these kind of incremental 5% efficiency gains, they're looking at it in the context of a right answer, right? A right answer exists. There's a process, it's taking orders. It's step A, B, C, D, and then you have outcome, and boom, there you go. Let's automate that. That's not the way to think about AI, in my view, right? I mean, can it do it? Sure. But the way to think about it is not for tasks and answers and situations that have a correct answer or an output, but rather the ones that have really tricky, where there is no right answer, right? Where there is no path. It's a decision. As a leader, as a CEO, and I'm sure in your case too, your job is making decisions. How do you know if it's a right decision, right? You don't. You never know. You,
Yeah.
you do the best you can. That's where, that's how I think people need to approach AI and approach these process improvements is there is, how do I apply this where there is no right answer? How do I apply this where it's not just, adding a macro in Excel that tabulates something, with the click of a button that you've installed, put into the sheet, but rather almost as another team member, right? How would you outsource this to another mind, right? And that is what I'm not seeing people grasp. And I think it's obvious in a lot of AI products these days that, I mean, I saw a a blender that said it had AI. And like, what are you talking? An AI blender? Like, I mean, so there's the marketing side of it, there's the hype side of it, but then there's also the actual mindset that I think is going to help people be successful with it. And to your point, it's not looking at discrete pieces of a process, it's looking at the entirety of the experience and saying the whole thing needs to be part of this. How does that connect? That's where you're getting that truly transformative jump, in my view, for organizations going forward.
And so on the idea of like an AI employee type thing. So I can walk you through what I've seen from our side and from all the other kind of other YC AI startups that we've talked to. So there is this one consistent problem, which is the models aren't quite good enough yet. And we see leaps and bounds improvements like every month or every week even, but we still have this kind of consistent thing where it's 90% effective, which means that it's not useful
Right.
because like a 10% error rate is typically too high for a lot of organizations to really trust something. If it's going to fail 10% of the time, then people are like a little bit more wary. And so a lot of people start off with the more lofty ideals of, oh, it's just a pure agentic based solution here. And what it's going to do is always like make the best decision. We're going to arm it with the tools. It's going to be something where it is kind of like an employee. You give it the vague task, it has the tools, they can go and do that job. And then I think a lot of people start out like this. It makes for really good demos because it's really great looking when it works. And it does work like 50% of the time. It works really well. But then the issue is that when you start trying to go from like the like working 80% of the time to working 100% of the time, this is where you get into the point where it's like you start hard coding things because you're like, well, this actually be way better if it wasn't agentic, if it was just a workflow. And so you start building out, okay, these are going to be the 10-step workflows that we're going to do. And it's this tough back and forth. And to be honest, I don't have a perfect answer for how people are going to solve it right now. It's the idea of like you go from something that's totally like AI agentic based and really cool, really flashy, but just not quite at that 100% rate. And then so you end up dialing things back to the slightly less effective version that's more consistent.
Well, there's a couple ways I think about that. I mean, I think the first important distinction to make is there's sort of two different mentalities and time frames that we're talking about here, right? As a AI company on your side, right, and talking to other YC type AI groups, you guys are in the thick of it, right? You're solving it today. You're making money. You got to get sales today, right? You're in that piece of it. I sit from, and I think that everything you said is absolutely accurate, right? I look at it from a different vantage point where 2 points on this one. One is that I can look out 5 years from now, which will be here before you know it. And at the pace at which things are advancing, that 90% accuracy rate is going to be essentially 100%, right, in time. It's inevitable. Now, whether it's 3 years or 6 years or five, who knows? But it's coming. Right? There's no question really in my mind that that's coming. So the the bigger challenge for me, and the way I'm sort of thinking about it as a leader of an organization, and I've led other larger organizations in the past, is that the the difficulty of preparing an organization and a team and stakeholders and human beings for that inevitable change is almost harder and almost certainly takes longer than the technical aspect of creating the ability to handle that sort of change. You know what I'm saying? So the technology is going to advance. You guys are going to figure it out. People are going to solve it. It's going to happen. Whether organizations are ready for that or not is the bigger question, because you could crack that nut tomorrow and roll it out and say, here's this pure, you know, AI employee, it's an agent, it'll just train it and let it go. And adoption would be almost nil at scale, particularly for smaller and mid-sized businesses, because they're afraid of it. They don't understand, right? When you think about most organizations, most people, they are not ready for that sort of thing. So tech is moving at a much faster pace and a much more capable pace than people and organizations and teams, right? So my focus has been to say I have every confidence that that's going to be solved for, that it's coming, it'll be here. What can I do today to start to prepare my team to move in that direction so that when that time comes, we are in a position, and I tell my team this all the time, that we should be able to handle 10 to 20 times the volume and workload at minimum, right, of what we do now with the same number of people that we have today. And that's probably underestimating the impact of it. So, how do we start to change that mentality of somebody who's been in the industry for 20 years, right? To say, all right, in maybe as soon as 3 years, certainly within 10 years, that will be an organization that is orders of magnitude larger in terms of output with the same, if not fewer people, right? That's the hardest part of it. So it's a long-winded way of saying that's a tricky problem you've got. I'm sure you're going to figure it out. I know I wouldn't bet against it. Changing the hearts and minds of people is the hardest part, and getting them to not be caught flat-footed when these things do come. and being at the leading edge of that revolution, I think is going to be important.
Well, this is where I honestly have a little bit of fear in the industry because
Yeah,
the question is, do you have time to wait? Because what will often happen, and I think small and medium businesses will likely be able to adopt things a little bit more quickly. Then you start looking at kind of like the large enterprises. These are the ones that like if the tech was ready today, they would be able to roll it out, 5 or 6 years from now. And
yeah,
so what you have in that meantime is imagine you do have the perfect, AI employee who can do this, who can totally 10x the amount of work that you can put out. Then what's stopping the, two-person company from being able to be two people plus, 150 agents that
yeah.
are able to run and do this?
Well, it's going to be an interesting time. No question about that. I mean, I think even if you were to take AI out of the equation, imagine it doesn't exist, right? I've written a lot about this lately, and I teach at Arizona State as well in the business school, just a couple of classes. And so I talk about this in my lectures a lot too, that we're coming to this inflection point as a society, right? As a species. When you look at like Strauss and Howe's concept of the fourth paradigm, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's a great concept and two books written on it. But it basically says that history is written in these chunks of time that essentially are the equivalent of a long human life. So think of it as 100 years, a saeculum, right? And that if you go back throughout history, every 100 years or so, there is conflict, there is division, there is massive societal change that happens, and then the world is reordered, and there's difficulty, and then you have the new order for a period of time, right? I would argue that we're in that period of time now, regardless. And I think you can just look. I mean, as we're recording this, the civil unrest that's happening nationwide, and the state of the macroeconomic, global economy, all of that. The thing that is interesting in that theory is that if you look at a long enough period of time, there are super cycles within those smaller cycles, right? Moments in time where the world radically changes and it is unrecognizable in an abnormally short period of time. And I suspect that AI and what you're talking about is that factor that's going to lead to that. So not only are we going to be going through this societal change, but the advent of this idea that, yeah, a two-person company could conceivably compete with, any sort of large, like a Microsoft, right? Manufacturing is always going to be a little bit more difficult until we have, Optimus up and running around and doing all that. But ultimately, we'll in our lifetimes live to see a day where a two-person company is a multi billion-dollar organization that can compete with, organizations in the past have had 30, 50,000 employees. There's no question about that. Again, because if you can have two agentic employees, you could have 2 million, right? You
Exactly.
could have any number, right? I mean, we're talking about a type of advancement and a type of scale that ultimately is going to be limited by electrons, not by anything else. It's going to be limited by our power consumption, right? Not anything else, which I
Well,
just think is
I
is a fascinating dynamic.
I think there is something else, and so the it's actually attention. So
Sure.
there's the what started the entire LLM wave was this great paper, "Attention is all you need." This is mostly talking about the internal like transformer architecture, but from a business owner side, if I had 150 AI agents at my disposal, then what do I tell them to do? And then how do I you also kind of have this like mentality that like I'm going to tell somebody to go do something, it's going to take them some amount of time, and then I'm going to use that time to think of the next thing that we need to do. But when I start divvying out tasks, it's just like coming back done,
Right.
5 seconds after me doing it. And so I guess you could imagine that you're going to have manager agents who are going to manage, you're going to have some sort of like hierarchy of agents here. We have a manager agent that manages other sub functions. But I think this is still probably one of the things where I don't know if there'll be that many two-person companies for just the sake of like you need to come up with what you want to do.
True. Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right that it is certainly going to be uncharted territory. And I would argue, like when I talk to my students, they the next generation of truly successful, transformative leaders and business owners are going to be the ones who can think in an entirely different fashion than we think today. Right? Our thinking today is limited by time in a lot of respects, to your point. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, but I mean, I feel like we are at the cusp of a cascade that no one is really ready for. I mean, if you think back to the early days of like pre-Manhattan Project, I think it was the University of Chicago or somewhere there, they were talking about the first reactions, controlled nuclear reactions. And they had the bricks of plutonium or uranium or whatever it was, and one of them slipped and pushed, and it started to become this this logarithmic, exponential, uncontrollable chain reaction, right? And the guy, I forget his name, but I think he died actually. He had to like reach in and replace the lead brick that stopped the reaction, and it killed him. But I think we're in that position now where, you know, the capability is going to be theoretically greater than our individual ability to manage it, right?
Right.
And so how do you how do you think, you know, extra dimensionally in some respect? You know, how do you think about that instantaneous sort of turnaround? I don't know, but it's going to be interesting. And there are going to be schools of thought, and I think, younger generations of people are that grow up on this. I mean, it's a little bit like, you know, I'm going to be 40 this year. And so effectively, my whole career, I've always had the internet. I've always had, the ability to research whatever, all of it. My children are have, the screen generation. They're used to having it in their pocket at a moment's notice. There's going to be another, and I think that generation will probably grow up and enter the workforce and the educational realm with tools like ChatGPT, like others at their disposal, and that will change the way their mind works. It will look very different than how my mind works and how my parents' mind works, and certainly, grandparents and the like. And that'll lead to some interesting and fruitful outcomes.
I think it's going to be probabilistic. I think that like statistical thinking will be really important here
Yeah.
because this is, you're actually, it's funny enough, I always thought that a lot of business school, because at least the business classes that I took in college were kind of useless because they
Oh,
always started you
absolutely.
off with like, they're like, so imagine that you're running Coca-Cola right now. And I'm like, this is not useful for me at all because I'm not running Coca-Cola, and it's going to be a long time before I'm running a 60,000 person company. But funny enough, maybe some of those types of lessons are actually going to be more valuable, which is imagine you've got 500 people in these different divisions working for you. How are you going to make different types of decisions? And it's actually is a very like probabilistic type thing. You're thinking less about the individual action and more about like you know the outcome and the chances of you being able to navigate to that outcome.
I would agree with that. And I also firmly agree, for the record, with the fact that college business classes are useless. I say that as a business school
Yeah.
professor. I'm tasked with teaching entrepreneurship. So talk about useless upon useless, right? I tell them, my students, every time that you're going to disregard everything I say, you're going to do it your own way, and you will be orders of magnitude more successful than I was, so all I can do is tell you what I learned the hard way and the lessons and the things that have helped me create a mental framework for thinking about challenges, right? And people, frankly, and share that with you. And do with it what you will. Me assigning you a grade for how you do that is ludicrous, right? It's utterly silly. And yeah, I think you're right. I think people are going to have to think probabilistically, and it's not just, do you have a team of 500 people? It's, do you have a team of 500 superhumans
Yeah.
working for you that are smaller or smarter and faster and near instantaneous, right? And that's just not something that we're used to thinking about because it's not realistic or hasn't been realistic, right? I mean, we forget that human bias and and limitations are baked into our very thought process, our
Yeah.
very idea. And what we're not even considering in any of things that we've talked about, and we're talking about LLMs and AI, but layer quantum computing on top of that, right? Layer that power on top of it, and we're in uncharted territory. It's not that we don't know how to use it, we don't even know how to think about it, right? I mean,
Right.
we can think about it abstractly, but it's not the same.
And this is where these cascades will happen too, because there is this one very grounding notion that there is units of work take time to get done. And
Mhm.
when we have faster compute plus AI agents, units of work will not take time. Or at least they'll take 45 seconds to a minute and a half. And more steps will happen in that process than you could like conceivably back into and actually like figure out what all happened right there. And so you'll have these kind of cascade effects. So it'll be really interesting to see how things shape out there. The one thing that always brings me comfort in here is thinking about what does not change. And actually, when you start trying to plot out the future and say like what's going to change, what's not going to change, there was actually still more I think that won't change. Namely, people will need food, and so you'll need to farm food. Farmers need tractors. They need a
Yep.
building to park the tractor in. You need to get a loan from the bank to build the building to park the tractor in. So there's a big amount of things that kind of exist today. I think are always going to be largely the same.
I agree. I mean, I have this fringe theory. And it's a crazy theory, all right? And I don't vocalize it much, but I think there's something potentially to it. And it's this idea that the future is going to look a lot more like the 19th century than some sci-fi future than we think about, right? For one of two reasons. Either all of the higher function thought and even creative functions in a lot of ways are going to be instantaneous, and we have to focus on food and tractors and bank loans and things like that we don't think about nowadays with agri-farming and everything else. It's going to be much more local and much more small, either in a positive sense because that's all there is to do, or things reach such a point from a conflict component that we're set back, right? There's some sort of cataclysmic war or something along those lines, and you're back towards more of a survival basis lifestyle or smaller, more local lifestyle because of necessity. I don't know. There's a nagging thought in my head that is a possibility that I never considered when I was younger. You think it's always going to be this straight line of advancement and comfort, and perhaps not.
I do lean more towards the first of the ideas, where there's going to be a little bit more of like a local first type communities. I think it's going to be actually driven more by surplus than by necessity. Hopefully, fingers crossed that there's not the cataclysm. I think that there is like, to be honest, there are a lot of things that people do on a day-to-day basis that they don't really enjoy doing. There are a lot of jobs
Mhm.
out there in just the a lot of the jobs that are right in the AI realm that are not the most enjoyable way to spend your time. Namely, a ton of the just sitting on meetings all day and plugging data back and forth, and being kind of like inside of some massive corporation where I think being a little bit more like local first, being kind of like more tied to something that is either in manufacturing or like in the process of building something, building a
Yeah.
community is a little bit better.
So, Tyler, are you suggesting the radical idea that unpausing a Zoom meeting that you haven't been paying attention to and just saying, nothing to add from my side is not fulfilling from a human perspective?
You know, for some people, for sure. It's got to be fulfilling for someone in the world, otherwise we wouldn't have so many of them. But I think the vast majority of the world might want to do something a little bit better with their time.
One would think. We are at an interesting point in human history, that's for sure.
Well, Chris, I have really enjoyed the talk today. It's been a great, great kind of segue from SBA lending onto, the eventual near-term AI future and what it might potentially mean for the world. So, love the full conversation direction.
Absolutely. Well, and honestly, it's something I go back to telling our small businesses about. I tell my students about. Anyone who'll listen is that those are the conversations that you need to be having now, right? This is not an incremental, nice to have sort of technology change that we're talking about. It's not even like the advent of the connectivity that the internet brought. It is meaningfully different. It is the creation of, it's probably going to ultimately be the pinnacle of human achievement at some point, right? The creation of another mind. And whether that seems extreme sitting here now, yes, of course it does. But all, you know, true visions of the future seem insane at the time. Right? They really do. But you've got to start thinking about that because the potential for rapid dramatic change is stronger than it ever has been. And you could say, well, how does that have anything to do with SBA lending? Well, it has everything to do with SBA lending. It has everything to do with everything, right? So you have to be thinking about those things and entertaining those thoughts now, so you're not just completely caught off guard when the future
And
arrives.
innovation, even beyond lending, I mean, innovation happens at the business level typically. And as a
Hmm.
result, it's important to have this, seems like relatively sci-fi, type of discussions like right now, just to understand like what could happen when we have kind of this cascading change that we have not seen before.
Hmm. Absolutely.
Well, Chris, I appreciate all the time today. It's been great to meet you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This has been a fun conversation.
All right.